Hey YouTube, what is up? This is Hypergon back again from the deck profile. This time I'm going to be doing one of my earlier decks that's evolved a lot throughout the time with me, Scraps. Like I said, this was a deck I've had for a while, but it started off actually as a Ancient Gear deck. Obviously it didn't work out too well, so I decided to quote-unquote scrap it, pun intended, and turn it into a scrap deck. But I still maintain part of the original Ancient Gear build in it, using let's see, what did I use? I used 3 Gear Towns, 2 Magical Hats, and 2 Ancient Gear Galvatron Dragons. And it worked pretty well, but obviously as the meta evolved, I wasn't able to keep up with things like Mermails or Dragon Rulers, so I ultimately had to get rid of it. It just wasn't working out for me. But then they announced Scrapyard, and I couldn't say no. And so that's the variant this one is, the ever popular Scrapyard build. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, what good would any scrap deck be without the 3 Scrap Chimeras? This card used to be the main monster in the deck, but ironically it hasn't actually been that way since Scrapyard came out. He's now more better for like a mid or late game recovery. Honestly, most of your other combo pieces revolving around basically every other scrap monster but him. He's still good, but just not what he once was. If I could find something better to replace him, honestly, I would. As opposed to the past where I wouldn't even think about it. But anyway, moving on. Got the best friend of Scrap Chimera, 2 Scrap Beast. Now, I know most people prefer to run 3 of these guys, but I'm just not big on that. I don't see the reason to run 3, since he only is a level 4 tuner and nothing else. And like I said, he basically just works really well with Scrap Chimera. For those of you who don't know, when Scrap Chimera is normal summoned, he special summons a just any Scrap tuner monster from the graveyard. So he's good for quick synchro summons, but unfortunately he can only use it for a Scrap synchro monster. So him and Beast are usually just to go into like a quick Scrap Dragon, which, you know, it's not a bad choice, but that's kind of why I said Scrap Chimera wasn't as good, just because he's limited in what he can go into, as opposed to Scrap Beast. Also, in terms of Scrap Beast, he is one of the many scrap monsters that has what I like to call the Scrap Recovery effect. It's an effect that most scrap monsters have, where when they are destroyed by the effect of a scrap card and sent to the graveyard, they can add 1 scrap monster from their graveyard to the hand. Chimera does not have this effect, but Beast does. Most of the tuners actually have this effect, and that's really the only good thing Scrap Beast has going for him, other than being a level 4 tuner. His other effect is nothing you're ever going to use. But anyway, moving on, we now have 2 copies of Scrap Orthros. This guy to me is much more useful and dynamic than Scrap Beast, even though he's also just a level 4 tuner because of his effect. He has the Scrap Recovery thing, but he also has an effect that says he cannot be normal summoned or set. It can only be special summoned while you control a scrap monster. So, when you do that, he pops a scrap monster on the field. This makes him really good for Scrapyard, as opposed to before that came out, where you would rarely see an Orthros run because he was alright at best. Now, he can be used to trigger Scrap Factory, which is amazingly good. You can just summon out Scrap Beast, then Orthros effect. You can pop either Orthros himself or Beast. In that situation, it wouldn't really matter. And then you can grab any scrap monster from the deck. So that makes this deck far more dynamic. Next up, we have 1 copy of Scrap Goblin. Goblin's kind of been a long time favorite. I used to run him at 3, but again, that was back in the older days. Now the deck's a bit faster, so I don't need to stall it out, but Goblin's still good for it. For those of you who don't know, his effect says that he cannot be destroyed by a battle. However, if he were to be attacked in face-up defense mode, he would be destroyed automatically during the battle, at the end of the battle phase, and then Scrap Recovery effect. And next up is a bit of an odd choice for some scrap decks, but I've still seen it played, is 2 copies of Scrap Worm. Now, there's two reasons I run this guy. One is he's also a trigger for Scrap Factory, just like Orthros and occasionally Goblin. He has the ability to attack directly. However, during the end of the battle phase where he did attack, he destroys himself, and then Scrap Recovery effect. But more than anything for me, he serves as a level 2 tuner monster, which in this deck can be pretty good for helping get things like Materia of Archaon. But the only issue is that so far all I've shown is him and Chimera, who by default would have to be my level 4 non-tuner, since everything else I've shown so far has been a tuner monster. But fortunately I do have an out for that. Out, 2 copies of Scrap Kong. I used to run Scrap Shark, but I feel like Scrap Kong is a bit less fragile. For those of you who don't know, Scrap Kong destroys himself on normal summon, and then does his Scrap Recovery. While that doesn't sound too great, in a deck that it can special summon as easily as this, there's plenty of ways to get him out aside from normal summoning. And even if you don't, you can just normal summon him with Scrap Factory out and then trigger Scrap Factory. A lot of the monsters I have in here are used to trigger Scrap Factory, but that's because it's basically like the new best card in the deck. But again, he also serves as level 4 non-tuner, and he's not specific on what he can go into, so if I use him and Worm, I can get a Barkion. But like I said, for ways to special summon him, we have the 2 Scrap Golems. This guy's pretty good. He, again, wasn't used as commonly before Scrap Factory just because he's a level 5 monster who can't special summon himself. He can, however, special summon every other Scrap monster. Specifically every level 4 or lower Scrap monster, but as you've seen, I only have him as being higher than level 5, so everyone else I can get. But the fun part about it is that he can actually special summon a monster to either player's side of the field. I know what you're thinking. Why on earth would you want to do that? Because of this guy, Scrap Searcher. With the exception of Golem and Chimera, this is the final card that, including Golem and Chimera, this is the final card that does not have the Scrap Recovery effect. All of the others I've shown you do. What this guy can do is that when a Scrap monster is destroyed, and sent to the graveyard, I can special summon him, and then he destroys all non-scrap monsters that I control. That's basically all that he does. The only catch is sorry, I'm just talking without thinking right now. As I was saying, the good thing about Golem with that is that if he summons Searcher to the opponent's side of the field, he was still special summoned, which means he blows up all non-scrap monsters on that side of the field. So that's basically a free board wipe. And if you do it when he's in attack mode, that's just a measly 100 attack against this giant 2300. So you can get in 2200 easily and wipe your opponent's field. Admittedly, destruction is not as big a thing anymore, but I still like it. And to round off the monster count, I have 1 copy of Redox, because every monster I run is an Earth monster, and who doesn't love a free Monster Reborn? Alright, like I said, that's it for the monster lineup. Next up we have the spells, and of course, what else are we going to start off with other than the 3 Scrap Factories? As I said, the new ace of the deck. For those of you who don't know how this works, all Scrap monsters gain 200 attack and defense. That doesn't really matter. But when a face-up Scrap monster on the field is destroyed by a card effect, that's the key difference between this and every other Scrap monster, is that this just has to be a card effect, while every other monster has to be a Scrap card effect. So this makes it a little bit more diverse, but once a Scrap monster is destroyed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 Scrap monster from your deck. You can only use this effect once per turn. But even with the once per turn, that's really all you need to start off a lot of your combos. And the main target you're going to be going for is actually going to be your Scrap Golem, just because he can special summon further and usually go into any monster that you need. He can grab Goblin and go into either Scrap Dragon or any other 8-star synchro. He can get a Beast or an Orthros and then go into Scrap Twin. The possibilities with this guy are quite honestly just endless. And since this card is oh so important to making the deck run, we have one copy of Terraforming to help search it out. And for additional power in this deck, combos really well with Scrap Factory, is 2 copies of Supply Squad. This card says whenever a monster is destroyed by battle or card effect, draw a card. So if you have Supply Squad and Scrap Factory out, you're going to be plussing for days. Just the chain links you can start by yourself with just summoning, drawing, popping things is hilarious. And trust me, it does take a while now. Anyway, next we have 3 copies of Scrap Storm. Again, I feel like this card's a little bit less dynamic than it used to be since Scrap Factory came out, but it doesn't mean it's still bad. It's a quick play spell that says you can target 1 Scrap monster you control. Then send 1 Scrap monster from your deck to the graveyard, draw a card, and then destroy the monster. The main thing you're going to do with this, or at least the main thing you did do with this, was that you would send a Chimera after you target whoever, just someone with the recovery effect, doesn't matter. Draw your card, and then when the other guy pops, you can just add Chimera back to your hand. It did allow you to continue your plays pretty nicely, but like I said, since Chimera is not as useful anymore as it used to be, you may want to go for something else or just set up a graveyard a bit better. It's really up to you. You can still go for Chimera. I do it from time to time, but more often than not, that's not really who I'm going to be going for. And again, it also serves for a nice little Scrap Factory trigger. Next up, we have 2 copies of Scrap Yard. Since a good chunk of our monsters are tuner monsters, Scrap Yard can add 1 Scrap Tuner from your deck to your hand, so it's a nice little search card. And for everything else, there's Scrap Storm, since all the Scrap Tuners do have that recovery effect, so it works quite nicely. Next we have our 1-ofs. We have 1 Soul Charge, 1 Dark Hole, 1 Foolish Burial. I don't think I need to explain these 2 at all, but this one I do feel warrants a bit of an explanation as opposed to why it's not a Raigeki. I know in my Dragunity deck profile I said it's because I'm cheap, but in this deck I do actually want it to be a Dark Hole because of Scrap Factory. Again, it only says card effect. It doesn't say Scrap card effect, and it doesn't say whose card effect, just a card effect. So my opponent has a big field, I can just summon a Scrap monster and then Dark Hole, and then all of a sudden, yeah, everything's wiped, but Scrap Factory is going to give me a monster because the Scrap monster I control was just destroyed by card effect. So in this particular case, I do actually prefer Dark Hole over Raigeki. I actually want my things destroyed half the time. And to round out the spells, we have 2 copies of MST and 3 copies of Forbidden Lance. Not a whole lot to it really, just back row popping and keeping my things safe from back row. It's just basic back row protection. That's it for the spells. Finally, we move on to the trap lineup. Not a whole lot for this one, just basic 1-ofs, Compulse, Bottomless, Torrential, and this one's a bit of an odd choice, but 2 copies of Scrap Iron Scarecrow. I know this isn't the most commonly used card, but I originally only threw it in there because I like to keep things thematic, and Scrap Iron Scarecrow, yeah, I know it's stupid, but it worked well for me just being able to stop attacks regularly. But if I could, I would probably swap these both out for a Glow-Up Bulb and a 1-for-1. Just because the 1-for-1 would give me 2 targets with Glow-Up Bulb and Scrap Searcher, and it'd give me another level 1 Earth Tuner to use. Actually, it would give me a level 1 Earth Tuner to use, I don't have any. But, as I have said several times before, I am cheap and do not want to spend that kind of money. I know it's only $10, but still. Alright, now for the extra deck. This got 1 Scrap Archfiend. I know he's not the best, but with the Scrap Chimera's limitation, you gotta have something to go into if all you have is a Goblin in the graveyard, or if all you can do is Sync 7, you gotta have something to do with him. And he's not a bad card, he's just a vanilla 2700, so if nothing else, he can't be Fiendish Chained, which is hilarious. Next up, we have the 3 Scrap Dragons. I don't think I need explaining this. He's the most flexible out of all the Scrap Dragons and the amount of decks he can be used. I'm sure you've heard of him, but just in case, he can target one card you control and one card your opponent controls, and then destroys them both. However, he has another effect that most people don't know about that's specific to the Scrap archetype, in that when he is destroyed, either by battle or by card effect, and sent to the graveyard, you can target a non-synchro Scrap monster in the graveyard and special summon it. So he kind of helps keep the recycling effect going. It's not the same as the others, but in my opinion it's a bit better. Just in case like you used a golem and a goblin to make this guy, if Scrap Dragon were to die, you could just get the golem back and then just make another one. Next up we have 3 copies of Scrap Twin Dragon, my personal favorite of the Scrap Synchros. This one is more specific though because it does require a Scrap Tuner as opposed to Scrap Dragon, who's just generic. But his effect says that once per turn you can target one card you control and 2 cards your opponent controls. Your card is destroyed, but your opponent's cards are returned to the hand. And then he also has that nifty little, when he's destroyed by battle or card effect, you can special summon a Scrap from the graveyard. What I really like about this thing is that it doesn't pop your cards, so it does actually kind of, like, just in case your opponent had something that needed to go to the graveyard, you can still get it out of the way and not worry about having to worry about it. So it's a nice little card to have, and again, 3,000 is pretty good, and that's without Scrap Factory. If you have Scrap Factory, he's 32, which is bigger than a Star Eater, which is hilarious. That's it for the Scrap Synchros. Next up we have 1 Beast and 1 Barkion, and this is an Earth deck that does Synchro Summoning. It's almost mandatory to run these guys because you gotta stop your spells and traps, or your opponent's spells and traps at least. Next up we have Stardust Spark Dragon and Hot Red Dragon Archfiend. I don't know, I just prefer these guys over the originals to some extent. If I can get Glow Up Bulb, I might replace him with a Stardust, just a regular Stardust Dragon, just so I can add a Formula Synchron and go into Shooting Star Dragon. But again, I would need a Glow Up Bulb before I even debate that first. And finally, for our big beefies, we have 1 Leo and a Star Eater. If that's hard to see, I apologize. It's a ghost rare, so kind of have to have the light hit it before you can see it. But trust me, it's a Star Eater. And that's it for the Synchros. The last cards I have is just 1 Diamond Dire Wolf and a Dark Rebellion Xyz Dragon. This is actually a good deck for Diamond Dire just because a lot of the monsters, despite it being what would look like a machine archetype, is actually just a bunch like beasts and stuff. So Diamond Dire can actually use a lot of the other cards as targets, destroy them, and then they get, if Scrap Factory's on the field, you can get the effect, plus you pop another card. And then Dark Rebellion Xyz Dragon is kind of like a Gagaga Cowboy in attack mode, where he cuts your opponent's monster in half and then he gets that. So it's just a good thing to help run over really, really big monsters that you can't otherwise do anything about. And that's it. That's my Scrap deck. Tell me what you guys think. As always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, peace out.